Hey everyone, it's SaturnDave from Sega Saturn SHIRO, and it's been 30 years of Sega Saturn. So, with the 30th anniversary of Sega Saturn's launch in Japan, I figured I would take a crack at answering some of the internet's questions about the Sega Saturn. And I figured we could start with this first panel here. What Sega Saturn? That's really poor grammar, but I can actually show you what a Sega Saturn is. This right here is a Sega Saturn. This is my first Sega Saturn that I ever got. Basically, New Year's '97, I picked up this Saturn used. This is what a lot of folks call a Model 2. At least the outer design is a Model 2. There are several internal board revisions, but this typically is called a Model 2. There's nothing really special about this other than the fact that I've had it since I was a teenager, so I have got a lot of attachment to it. I daily drive this. I've got other Saturns, but this one gets the most love from me for sure. And basically, the Saturn was Sega's 32-bit outing. It was their successor to the Genesis or Mega Drive, the 16-bit console, and then of course the 32X, which kind of came in the middle there. But yeah, the Saturn was their answer to 3D gaming, basically, and also like the pinnacle of 2D gaming. Saturn was an excellent console, and we're gonna get right into it with some more questions from the internet. Yeah, and our first question is, what happened to Sega Saturn? That is a good question. And I guess I'll try to do the Reader's Digest version. So basically you got the Genesis or Mega Drive, which does great in America, but not so well in Japan. And so in Japan, they really want to put out their next console, the 32-bit Saturn that they've been working on since like late 91, early 92. It's been in the oven for a while. They want to get it out. They've also heard about Sony throwing their hat in the ring with PlayStation, and Sony's bragged about their specs. It's going to be a very 3D focused machine. So Sega beefs up the computational power of Saturn by adding a second CPU and then says, we're going to get this thing out late 94. Sega of America doesn't want to do that. They want to keep milking the Genesis for what it's worth. So they propose a 32-bit add-on, the 32X. Sega of Japan agrees, and they do a simultaneous launch in November of 1994. However, the consumers in America don't bite, and the 32X doesn't sell. So Sega of Japan insists that Sega of America pushes the Saturn out in May of 1995. So at E3, May 11th, 1995, Sega of America pushes out the Saturn to get a jump on Sony, which is going to put out the PlayStation soon. And of course, it's rushed to launch. Developers don't have enough time to finish the launch titles. They don't have enough stock for retailers. They really have to pick and choose which retailers get stock of Saturn. Their marketing campaign is weak sauce. Not a lot of people know about the Saturn, and those who hear about it, the marketing doesn't really resonate with them, which ultimately leads to a poor position in the market for the Saturn, at least in the West. And it should also be mentioned that a lot of this resulted in poor relationship with third-party developers. So Sega lost a lot of third parties to Sony, which, you know, treated them arguably better. But that was all in the West. Meanwhile, in Japan, the Saturn did incredibly well. It was Sega's most successful console in Japan. They had a great marketing campaign with Sagata Sanshiro. They had a ton of games that were really focused towards the Japanese audience, and you know, it just everything they did in Japan seemed to work really well for them, whereas, you know, it just misfired over in the West. And so that's kind of what happened to the Sega Saturn, I guess you could say. Subsequently, a lot of other great stuff has happened to the Sega Saturn. The homebrew scene has blown up. Sega Saturn SHIRO, we got our start back in 2017 doing a podcast, website, and a YouTube channel dedicated to Sega Saturn. There's a homebrew game contest every year. There have been just a ton of fan patches. So a bunch of Japanese Saturn games being translated into English for folks to appreciate and enjoy in English. So yeah, there's a lot of other stuff that has happened to the Sega Saturn, arguably, but I'm guessing that's what folks are wondering about, is like what originally happened to the Sega Saturn. So yeah. And our next question is, what if the Sega Saturn was successful? What if I told you that the Sega Saturn was successful? The Sega Saturn was successful in Japan. So if you're wondering what it would look like if the Sega Saturn was successful, you really just need to look at Japan, because over there, they really designed this console. for Japanese audiences. The games were laser focused on Japanese tastes, and maybe the West hadn't really caught up to that yet. You know, of course, subsequent years, the West has really caught up to Japanese tastes and game genres and stuff like that. But back then, you know, arguably, maybe not so much. The Saturn had a great marketing campaign in Japan with Sagata-san SHIRO, who would come to your house and kick your ass if you didn't play the Sega Saturn. You know, it was very self-deprecating in a way, you know, but it was very funny, and it resonated with Japanese audiences. And so the console, just everything was poised for success over in Japan and did quite well against the Nintendo 64. It was more popular, and it was more popular than the PlayStation initially, but then the PlayStation caught up once the RPGs like Final Fantasy VII came out and stuff. But for the most part, I mean, it still enjoyed like a good solid second place in Japan. So really, if you want to know what it would be like if the Saturn was successful, just take a look at Japan. But also, how do you measure success? Because conservative estimates say that the Saturn sold, Sega themselves say 8.8 million, so let's just go with that number. For you to be able to sell 8.8 million of anything and not be considered a success, it really comes down to success by comparison, right? You know, because PlayStation sold like in the hundreds of millions, and you know, Nintendo 64, of course, did markedly better than the Saturn as well worldwide. So really, we're talking about success by comparison. But if you just take it by its own merits, you know, Saturn's a great console with great games, and it did quite well in Japan. And fun fact, it also did great in Portugal too, where it also enjoyed quite a bit of success. So there you go. If you want to know what it would look like if the Saturn was a success, just look at Japan or Portugal. I'll also add to that in terms of like, would it change Sega's fortunes if the Saturn was more successful? Honestly, it's speculation, you know? So I think that we can all agree that Sega made several mistakes. It wasn't just one mistake that could really turn the tides of their fortunes. I think that it was a lot of things, you know? And so, you know, maybe if the Saturn was more successful, yes, they would have sold more and made more money and maybe put the Dreamcast in a better position to succeed. And who knows, maybe they would still be in the hardware business, but we really don't know. There was a lot of poor accounting going on back then. There was also a lot of infighting between Sega of America and Sega of Japan. So I don't really think that one console could really turn the tides of Sega's fortunes, if that's what this question might be insinuating, but I figured I would just add that as a side note. Next question. Let's see what we have here. What is the cartridge slot on Sega Saturn? This is a good question. I think we all asked this back in the day. So yeah, the cartridge slot on the Sega Saturn, I think pretty much all of us, you'd be lying if you said that you didn't think this was for backwards compatibility back in the day. When we caught wind of the plans for Saturn and saw pictures of it, we saw this cart slot and we were super excited because we thought it was for Genesis, Mega Drive games. Figured, we'll be able to play our entire, you know, previous library and this, you know. Unfortunately, I think probably due to costs, how complicated the architecture was, the board design was like really crowded. For whatever reason, they decided to not go in that direction, and instead it's just a really fast I/O bus that allows for several enhancements to the console. You can get a 1 or 4 meg RAM expansion cart, and you can play some of the Capcom and SNK 2D fighters. And with that cart, they're almost one-to-one with the arcade. You get fluid frames of animation. There's also a backup cart that you can buy to transfer all your saves from the internal to the cart memory. There's also a Netlink modem that you can use to play online with your friends. And there are some ROM carts that exist only for a couple of Japanese only games. So yeah, basically it would end up being like an enhancement slot, but not a, not really for backwards compatibility. These days, you've got things like the Saru cart, you know, which would go in there and allow you to play games off the cart, kind of like a flash cart. You also have things like the Action Replay and the Pseudo Saturn carts that allow you to kind of boot, burn games on the Saturn. But yeah, essentially that is what the cart slot is for. So now you know. Okay, next question. What is the best model of Sega Saturn? That's going to be kind of subjective, and I think that there are kind of multiple answers. So, you know, it might just come down to personal preference. If you are the collector type who wants to go deep into Saturn and maybe you're looking for something that's rare or sought after, you got things like the JVC Victor V Saturns or the Hitachi High Saturns, the High Saturn Navi with GPS and the LCD screen. Incredibly expensive, rare and sought after. You've also got things like the Super Prologue 21, which is basically a huge karaoke unit with an amp and a mixer, and there's a Saturn built in. Even more rare and sought after are those, and good luck getting one. But there's also just standard run-of-the-mill Saturns. Like if you're just looking to play the Sega Saturn, I would say probably the best Saturn is the one that you can get readily available for a good deal, you know, maybe like 40 to 60 bucks. You know, the price on Saturns keeps going up, and I've seen them even for like 80 and 100. But you can get one with a blown out CD drive and just put an ODE in there and play games off a flash cart or internal ODE. What I would say though, the early revision Saturns had kind of like a slap together design because they were really trying to rush the console out to market as quick as they could. And so you had things like a lot of daughter boards inside. Sometimes they'd be mounted to the top of the case. And so if you're trying to take it apart and service it, you got to be real careful not to, rip out some of the cables that are connecting the top to the bottom. Not as easy to take those apart as like the later ones where they would streamline the PCB into a nice clean design, no extra daughter boards. Eventually they even were able to fit two CPUs, the Hitachi SH2s, onto a single die, and even further cost cut and be able to not lose so much money on each console sold. You hear a lot of anecdotal stories about, Model 1s having better CD drives, but I've also heard people say that quote unquote Model 2s, let's just say like the later revisions of Saturn, having the better CD drives. I've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence across the board. I don't really know that I could tell you that one is better than another. Some folks really like the look of the early case design. Some people like the look of the latter. And that's really personal preference. You do have some sites out there claiming that the Model 1s, or at least like the early revision Saturns, have marginally better video output, cleaner RGB output, and it's almost negligible. So I mean, if you're really discerning when it comes to like RGB output and you want the cleanest signal, you might go with like the earlier revision Saturns. But honestly, if you're just looking to pick up a Saturn and you don't have one, the best one might just be the one that's on OfferUp or on Craigslist or on Facebook Marketplace. So that's a good deal and it's close to you, and you can just pick it up and get started with the Sega Saturn. And once you're in, there's a rabbit hole that you can go down, but it really is going to come down to personal preference. Next question here. What do we got? What are the best games on Sega Saturn? Okay, I feel like this question is kind of subjective because it's going to depend on you and your genre preferences. But I think I can objectively say that there are hundreds of great games on the Sega Saturn. Either whether you're just limiting yourself to domestic or if you're importing. Definitely if you're importing Japanese games, you've got over 1,000 games to choose from, and so many of those are bangers. I don't have a list with me or anything like that, but I'll try to go off the top of my head and give you guys some recommendations. Obviously, you got the ones that you hear about, stuff like Panzer Dragoon Saga, right? Those are going to be the really expensive games that are probably impossible to collect, but you can still, download them and play them and give them a shot. I highly recommend that series, the Panzer Dragoon series. It was a launch series on the Saturn with Panzer Dragoon. Panzer Dragoon 2 Zwei kind of cranked it up a notch, gave you branching paths. It's a great shooter, highly recommend it. Beautiful game. And then of course Panzer Dragoon Saga is great. You have games like Daytona USA, also a launch game, so much fun. Arcade racer, slippy slidey, drifting arcade action. Low frame rate, but I don't think that kills it. I think it's still a really fun game. And you've also got racing games like Sega Rally Championship, which is a gem, Sega Touring Car Championship. You've got Road Rash, you've got Wipeout, you've got so many other racing games to choose from. I can't even think of them right now, but you've also got fighting games like Virtua Fighter 2, Fighters Mega Mix, Fighting Vipers are great 3D fighters. Last Bronx is great. You've also got the 2D fighters like Marvel Superheroes, Street Fighter 2 Alpha. You've got Night Warriors, Darkstalkers. And then on the Japanese side, you got so many more SNK fighters and Capcom fighters like Street Fighter 03 and Marvel vs. Street Fighter. You've got puzzle games like Baku Baku Animal and Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo. There are some great adventure games like D and Lunacy. and some survival horror games like Resident Evil, of course, is great, and Deep Fear is great. It's kind of a Resident Evil clone put out by Sega and System Seicom. That was amazing. You have Enemy Zero, Kenji Eno's follow-up to D, and that was also amazing. The Sonic Jam compilation, which is all the original Sonic games on the Genesis, and that's a really nice, not even port, it's actually like recoded for the Saturn, and it runs great and feels great. You've got so many great sports games like Winter Heat and Decathlete and NBA Jam, World Series Baseball 2 and World Series Baseball 98. And you've got Worldwide Soccer 97 and 98. Those are great soccer games. You got some awesome side-scrolling games like Shinobi Legion, KO Flying Squadron 2, Mega Man X4. You got some amazing RPGs like Albert Odyssey, Shining Force 3, Shining the Holy Ark, shooters. There's a ton of great shooters on the Saturn. It's probably one of the best consoles for vertical and horizontal shmups. You got stuff like Battle Garaga and Radiant Silvergun. You got Guardian Force, and and I failed to mention Guardian Heroes, which is another side-scrolling kind of like beat-em-up RPG style thing. So there's just so many games, and I mean, these are the ones that are high profile as well, that we hear a lot about. There's so many underrated gems in Japan. I don't like using the term gems, but I mean, when it comes to Saturn, which is a console a lot of people slept on, you really can consider a lot of them gems, because a lot of people just haven't even heard of these games. And there are even some games that I'm finding out about even today that I've slept on, you know. So there's just so many great games. I highly recommend you check out Sega Lord X or the Sega guys. I only scratched the surface of what's good on Saturn, but there's just so much great stuff on Saturn. Really just go check out like a listicle online and look at some video of gameplay, and you'll be able to find something that you like. All right, next question. These are hard. What is the best Sega Saturn emulator? Okay, so that's going to depend on what you need. Let's say you just want to emulate Saturn on a PC, and you just are interested in emulating at standard resolution, you know, and you want really good stability. You want to be able to run it on a underpowered machine. I would go with SSF. That's a closed source emulator by one guy who's been doing it for years, like a couple decades it's been out, and it does run on basically a potato. It's been used as the core for what they're doing on the Switch, you know, Switch Saturn emulation. SSF, I believe, is at the core of that. But it's a really good, stable emulator. If you need more bells and whistles, more features, I highly recommend Mednafen. That's a great Saturn emulator with a bunch of extra features. And it can do stuff like texture scaling and increase resolutions, and it can really make the Saturn output look a lot better than it originally was, subjectively better if you're looking to, you know, game in like 4K, like Saturn in 4K. You've also got things like Yabaoz, which is great for like developers, and it's a really good like testing emulator for developers, and it's also great on Android. So if you have like a smartphone and you want to play on a smartphone, I think Yabaoz is the one, or at least a fork of Yabaoz is the emulator to go for that. So you got a lot of different use cases. There's also one called Beetle, which is great. Check that out. I don't have a lot of experience with it, but I've heard great things about it. But again, I mean, the ones that come to mind are either SSF for stability and just, you know, playing Saturn in standard resolution, or, you know, Mednafen, Yabaoz, and maybe Beetle. Those are the kind of the ones that come to mind when I think of good Saturn emulators. Our next question is, what problems does Sega Saturn have? I want to say Saturn doesn't have nearly as many problems as other consoles do. And that might sound biased because I'm a Saturn guy, but I mean, I love the PlayStation as well. I love the Nintendo 64. I've got those consoles as well. It doesn't have the kind of drive issues that you would have with the PlayStation. You know, some folks would have to like turn their PlayStations on their side or something to get it to read discs and stuff. Saturn never really had that problem for me. My CD drive did finally burn out like a year or two ago, but I mean, it was going strong from 97 all the way up to like 2022, 23. So I mean, that was a really long service life, and for half of that it was playing burned games. So I mean, I really don't feel like I can knock the drives too much, and they are replaceable, or you can just get an ODE or a flash cart, right? I can't really, you know, say anything bad about the CD drives per se. I could probably say, you know, a lot of people kind of knock the cart slot, right? Because they say that this right here, these pins are really, really small, and they're kind of finicky, and sometimes you'll have a hard time getting good contact between the cart and the pins, and that can even lead to like corrupted data on your backup cart. If you know, you pop it in there and you boot up the console and it recognizes the cart, so you think it's working, but one of the pins don't have a good connection, and you go to save and that data gets corrupted, and you don't even know it until you try to boot the game later and load that save, and it says, oh, your save data is corrupted, and you're halfway through Shining Force 3 and you've lost everything, right? You know, that's a bummer. And that's why I would say back up your saves often. You have things like Slinga's save game copier, which are, you know, tools in the homebrew community. If you have an ODE, you can kind of load that and back up your saves to SD card, you know, which is a good thing. But, you know, some folks also in the community have discovered that it's really not as big of an issue as we've always thought it was, that it really comes down to the cleanliness of the edge connector on your cart. If you have a good quality cart with a beveled edge connector, which means that the edge kind of comes to a point on either side so that it doesn't stretch out those pins when you put the cart in there. And then also, if you take like a pencil eraser and you kind of clean the contact pins so that there's no dirt on there, you can use like a pencil eraser, and then also use like a cotton swab with isopropyl alcohol to kind of just clean them off and make sure that they're, you know, very, very clean. And you pop that in. Sometimes it's just dirt and grime that you can't even see with the naked eye, that just kind of like forms on the pins, that makes it hard to get a good connection. It really just could come down to the cleanliness of the carts that you're putting in there. But that's one of those things that they say is kind of like a problem with the Saturn. Another one I guess I would bring up is both a blessing and a curse. You've got here on the back of the Saturn, if I can get this open. Well, here's a problem. This door is really hard to get open. But in the back here, you have a little CR2032, I think it is. I forget what the code is on there, but it's one of those little button cell batteries. And that is what powers your backup save RAM, the internal save RAM of the Saturn. And that'll go out, you know, sometimes it'll last like 2 years. I've had it last like 2 years for me. Then sometimes I've had it last like a year. It really probably depends on the battery. Are you buying like a good, you know, long-lasting Duracell battery, or are you buying like a cheap, you know, Amazon special or whatever, you know? So that'll go out, and you may lose your saves. But of course, nowadays we have ways of backing up saves, so it's not nearly as big of an issue. Sometimes this right here, this little connector on the back where the power is, that can get brittle. And by plugging it in and unplugging it over time, if you're taking your Saturn different places with you or setting it up, those can break. But I mean, there are replacements for that as well, for the power supply. And this one I've not done any modifications to. I've not put in a new power supply. I have another one with a replaced power supply. But yeah, that also might be a trouble point. But those are the things that I think kind of stand out in terms of Saturn. All right, so last question on this panel here. What Sega Saturn? Let's see. What is a Sega Saturn worth? Okay, so I'm guessing they're just asking like what the value is. That's gonna vary wildly depending on what we're talking about. If we're talking about just a used Saturn with a blown out laser that you're gonna put an ODE in, or maybe you have one and you're selling it, probably like $30, $40. And I mean, you know, that's a testament to, you know, how the prices of Saturns have gone up. If you are asking about one that's like in really, really good condition And I mean, it's like a Western Saturn, you know, anything between $80 and $120, depending on the condition and what marketplace you're buying it from. If you're talking about complete in box, you could be looking at anywhere between $100 and $300, depending on condition. If you're importing from Japan, they're a lot cheaper, of course. They're very plentiful, and the condition is great because stereotypically Japanese people take really good care of their stuff, and a lot of times you can buy a Saturn that's listed as junk just because they haven't tested it, but then you get it and it turns out that it works perfectly fine and it's in great condition to boot. So sometimes those can be had between, you know, 40 to 60 bucks with shipping. You've got, of course, the rare collector's items, the highly sought after and very hard to source things like the High Saturn Navi, which are going to be around like, I don't know, $5,000. I'm just pulling that number out, but I'm thinking it's around like $5,000. You've got things like the Super Prologue, which are also incredibly hard to source and are just going to be ridiculous amounts of money. I really don't know what those are currently going for, but it's in the thousands, obviously. But you got things like the V Saturn, for example. I think those would probably go anywhere between like 160 to 350, somewhere around that range. And it's all going to be depending on the condition of the console, whether they're complete in box. But that's kind of where the range of the console is worth. The games itself, though, that's where the prices get ridiculous. And of course, I feel like the market is kind of gone on a lot of the games, just because, especially the domestic stuff in the West, you know, a lot of those long box games are just like, it's not worth paying those prices. But I mean, you know, if you're importing Japanese games, you can get quite a few of those for relatively cheap, between $10 and $30 for a game. And anything that's, you know, more sought after, like some of the 2D fighters or shmups, you know, are going to be more in like the $80 to $200 per game tier. You know, you've of course got games that are up in the thousands, you know, but I mean, again, like, you know, I imagine that when people ask like, what is a Sega Saturn worth, they're really talking about the console. Okay, so next up we've got does Sega Saturn. So let's see what we've got here. Does Sega Saturn play burned games? Yes and no. No, it won't just play burned games without any help. Okay, a lot of those early CD based consoles like the Sega CD, the 3DO, the Neo Geo CD, you could just burn a CD, you know, copy of the game and pop it in there. And as long as the CD was authored correctly, you know, and you were using good media, you know, that was reflective enough, you could just pop it in and boot it up, you know, and those consoles didn't have any kind of copy protection. The Saturn had some amazing copy protection that still hasn't been defeated to this day. It had like a physical wobble that was pressed into the disc, and it acted as a key that would unlock the ability to read the data on the disc. And if you didn't have that, you just couldn't boot a game. So basically you need some way of defeating that copy protection on Saturn, and either it's going to be in the form of doing like a swap trick where you use a retail disc and then pull it out real quick and swap in the burned disc. I don't recommend that. That's really hard on the hardware and the laser. You could break something. So I don't recommend it. Sometimes it's necessary in certain situations, but I really don't recommend it. And of course nowadays with ODEs it's just not even an issue. But you know, for a long time, you know, we used things like boot carts, you know, like the pseudo Saturn boot cart. You could either buy one on Amazon for like 40 bucks, or if you had an old action replay cart, which was used for like cheats, you could flash that with the pseudo Saturn Kai firmware. It would essentially turn that into a boot cart, and you know, that would basically cut in to the Saturn's boot sequence and just say, okay, I'm taking over here. We're allowing them to boot burned CDs. Sega themselves also had these like boot CDs that they gave to developers that would do the same thing. Basically, it was kind of like the swap trick, but instead it was a safe way to do the swap trick where you'd put in one of these boot CDs and it would force the Saturn to like stop the CD-ROM drive and allow you to take it out and put in the new disc. And that's kind of how they did it. Also mod chips. If you have a mod chip installed in your Saturn, there's a couple. There's like the old Rob Webb chips. There's like the Phantom mod chip. Any mod chip that you install in your Saturn that allow you to play burn games without any kind of cart or anything like that. You just pop in a burn game and off to the races, you know. So there are mod chips as well. Those have kind of fallen out of favor with the advent of ODE options, but you know, some folks still rock discs in their disk drive, and a mod chip is a good option for that. So yes, the Saturn can play burned CDs, but no, it can't do it just stock. You do need some way to defeat that copy protection. And honestly, that's kind of what's been kind of holding back the homebrew scene from really flourishing on like a commercial level. Like whereas Dreamcast, folks were able to come in and exploit that mill CD support on the Dreamcast, and as a result, you've had a lot of commercially released homebrew games. On the Saturn, that's not the case, because we can't essentially defeat the copy protection on the Saturn. In order to release any kind of homebrew application, you'd have to also, you know, pack in a boot cart or some kind of boot method. It would basically have to be bring your own boot method with the Saturn. So it's unfortunate, but again, we're living in the era of ODEs, optical drive emulators, and flash carts. So we don't really need to burn CDs anymore, unless you really want to. I hope that answers that question. Next, does Sega Saturn need memory card? Does Sega Saturn need memory card? So no, it doesn't need a memory card, I was very surprised to find out that back in the day when I first got a Sega Saturn, I assumed that it needed a memory card because in my household, we had already had a PlayStation and I was used to memory cards, right? And so when I picked up my Sega Saturn as my own console, I just assumed I wouldn't be able to save my games until I saved up enough money to be able to go back and buy a memory card. But it turns out that on day one, you have that little battery backup save. The console has it has a BIOS, you know, with a complete menu, and it has internal save memory that you can manage and format from the BIOS. And I was amazed to find that out as, you know, 14 or 15-year-old me, that this had internal storage all the way back then. Trailblazing, right? Technically, the Sega CD had it as well, but that was an add-on. So if you got the Sega CD and added it onto your Genesis or Mega Drive, you would have internal backup save as well. But the cart slot would also give you expanded save if you got the backup cart. But either way, you had saves right on the console from day one. Okay, next question. Does Sega Saturn have memory cards? Basically just answered this question. Yes. This is the official backup cart for the Sega Saturn. And yes, it has these. You could get them at retail, and I think they were about like $40. I'm guessing there, but I think that was about the price. Nowadays, they're a lot more just because it's kind of a collector's item. There weren't that many. Sega didn't make that many of them. You know, so I mean, but you can still get them on eBay or, you know, Amazon secondhand. You've also got carts like the Action Replay. These use their own proprietary compression for saves. So you can't really load saves from this while in game, but you could, through their own menu, you know, back up all of your saves from the internal memory to here and have it kind of saved. But yeah, so you've got the internal RAM of the Saturn, you've got the backup cart, the official backup cart, you got things like Action Replay, and then of course, with new solutions like the Saru cart, that has per game save on it, and it just creates a save file for each game that you play that is saved to the SD card, the same SD card that you're booting the games off of. So that's really awesome. And then, you know, things like the Satiator and the Fenrir, they also have options for you to back up your saves to an SD card as well. So luckily, we're living in days where there's really no good reason to lose your saves on your Saturn anymore. I mean, it can still happen if you're not careful, but basically you have no excuse. Next question we have is, does Sega Saturn support RGB? Yes, Sega Saturn supports RGB. It has beautiful RGB. Compared to some RGB signals, Saturn's got really, really clean RGB. and it's beautiful to look at. When you finally switch from, you know, composite and S-video over to RGB, one of the things you notice first is just how much the colors pop. And I think that really is the biggest leap right there. You know, I mean, video quality for S-video is great, all things considered, but going from composite or S-video to RGB, you just notice how much the colors pop, and you're really seeing like the true colors that the Saturn is capable of. I highly recommend that if you have a Saturn, that you get an RGB solution for it, because there's a lot of solutions out there. I recommend like the Rad2X cables are just a simple cable. It'll go right from the back of your console to HDMI, and that'll give you scaling and RGB, and it's a great device. I don't work for the company that makes them. I'm just saying that's a really good solution that doesn't really introduce any lag, any perceivable lag. Next question is, does Sega Saturn support SCART? Also, yes. And I mean, that's a good question to go with the RGB, because if you're not going to get one of those de facto, you know, bespoke cables that just goes Saturn to HDMI, another option you have is getting like a SCART cable, an RGB SCART cable. And SCART is, it's basically a connection standard that was used a lot in Europe and PAL territories, not so much here in the West. Right, so this is a SCART style connector. However, this is a JP21 cable. So the pinout is different. It's a Japanese pinout, but the connector is the SCART standard. And in PAL territories, you'd get the same connector with a different pinout, but essentially all these pins give you a myriad of different outputs, and RGB is one of them. The ability to carry RGB and audio all on the same connector is what SCART is all about. You can get really good quality cables like this with shielding that'll go, you know, Saturn to SCART, and then you can get a scaling device which will either line double or scale your image up to a TV without introducing any kind of lag. The RetroTink products are awesome for that. You got like the Tink 5X, and there's things like the OSSC and the older FrameMeister. But yeah, so Saturn definitely does support SCART, and I just highly recommend for folks who are playing their Saturns on a flat panel like a LCD or OLED that you do look into a SCART and RGB solution. And like I said, if you just want to go easy, get like the Rad2X. It's a single cable that'll do everything for you, and it's going to give you a really good output, all things considered. So next up we have, does Sega Saturn play cartridges? We already kind of covered this. The answer is no. Well, actually it's yes and no. Okay. For the longest time, the answer was no. Okay. No, the Saturn was never backwards compatible with Genesis Mega Drive. No, it doesn't play those kind of cartridges. And if you want to get really technical, there are some games in Japan, a couple, like King of Fighters 95, that does come with a ROM cart that has actual game data on it. And in that case, yes, it's streaming game data off of the cartridge. So technically it's playing a game off the cartridge, but I don't think it's what most people are asking with this question. The Saturn doesn't really play cartridges. However, with the SARU cart, which just recently came out, it now does technically play a cartridge. Although it's kind of a trick answer, because yeah, with the SARU cart, you now can have games on your SD card, your micro SD card, and you're technically playing games off the cart, and it loads very, very fast. So that's cool. There is one caveat that I'll mention. There's a Japanese game called Daisomon 2, which is like a build your own shmup game. And there's so much creativity in that game. There are so many fans of that game that have made incredible shmups that can be loaded off of a cart. So if you have, say, like the OEM backup save cart, or you have like the Saturn Gamers cart, which is, you know, kind of a niche thing, but you can look it up, Saturn Gamers cart. You can technically load those shmups off of an SD card, and there are some amazing shmups that fans in the fan community have made using Daisomon 2. So that's kind of like another trick answer. But yeah, so long story short, no, you can't play retail games on cart, but yes, with the Saru, you now have like a flash cart solution that will allow you to play games off a cart. So I don't know, you decide. Last but not least on this panel, we have, does Sega Saturn play Genesis games? And we pretty much just took care of that question with the last one. Does it play cartridges? No, Sega Saturn doesn't play Genesis games per se. However, there are some exceptions, I guess you could say, like the Sonic Jam collection, right? Those are all Sonic games that were on the Genesis that can now be played on the Saturn, you know? So that maybe there are some like fringe exceptions like that, but still you're playing it off of a disc, right? And it's a compilation, right? You know, so the answer is no, the Saturn does not play Genesis games. Definitely not via cartridge or anything like that, but check out the Sonic Jam collection. It's awesome. Next up, we've got, is Sega Saturn what? Can't wait to find out. Let's see. Is Sega Saturn region locked? Yes. Sega Saturn is region locked, though it's not a huge deal to overcome. Even back in the day, during the Saturn's life on the market, we had things like called the ST key, which was a cart that would allow you to boot games from a different region. Even the official Sega Saturn magazine, the folks that wrote for that would recommend that you have your console modded with a region switch. And a lot of folks did. Folks who modded their console with a mod chip, that would allow you to play burn games, would also allow you to just pretty much boot any disc from any region, and the same thing can be said for if you have a pseudo cart, or an action replay. All those cart solutions will allow you to boot games from any region, Of course, if you're booting games from an ODE, optical drive emulator, then you don't have to really worry about this either, because those all have the capability to just boot any game from any region, but yeah, so technically Saturn is region locked, but it's not really a big issue. If you're only playing retail games, and that's it, you have like a US Saturn and you're only playing retail games, you're gonna need a way to boot Japanese games on that system. So you are going to need something like an action replay cart or a pseudo cart. But I mean, if you are playing burn games, I'm already assuming that you have one of those. Or if you're playing games off an ODE, then you're already set. So next up is Sega Saturn backwards compatible? A lot of these questions are like repeat questions. No, Saturn is not backwards compatible. Again, we thought it would be before it came out, and then everybody was kind of surprised and disappointed to find out that cart slot could not play Genesis games. I think everybody at least tried it, probably tried smashing a Genesis game in there, and then found out that no, that doesn't work. And so no, Saturn is not backwards compatible, but it is compatible with over 1,000 games in Japan and over 200 games in the US. So there's a lot of games you can play on it, just can't play Genesis games on it. Unless we're talking about the Sonic Jam collection, which, again, plug for the Sonic Jam collection. All right, next up is Sega Saturn good? Yes, Sega Saturn is good. Okay, I'm biased, so, you're asking a guy who does like a podcast and website for Sega Saturn. Of course, I'm going to tell you Sega Saturn is good. But, I think objectively Sega Saturn is good. I think that not to knock, things like the Atari Jaguar or the 3DO. I actually am a big 3DO fan. And the Atari Jaguar has some good games on it too. But whereas those are consoles where a lot of the games are crap and you kind of have to look hard to find the good stuff on those consoles, it's not really hard to find good games on the Saturn. You don't have to look far. In fact, I would say that if you love PlayStation and you were a huge 32-bit PlayStation fan back in the day, then the Saturn is a perfect console to get into today. You'll find a ton of stuff that you can engage with, and a ton of great stuff. Fighters, shmups, racers, RPGs, you name it, puzzle games. There's just so much good stuff on Saturn. Saturn's such an awesome console. It looks sexy. It's got a bunch of great features built into it. It's got one of the greatest gamepads on Earth. I think that this is arguably, at least this one, is one of the better gamepads that we've ever seen, so for that reason I say yes, the Saturn is objectively good, and I think that you should play it. Okay, and last for this panel we've got, let's see here, is Sega Saturn worth collecting? Well, like I said before, I feel like the market is kind of gone. That is to say, like, a lot of the games are just, we've been priced out, and it's like reseller prices, unless you really, really love the Saturn and you're willing to, just kill your wallet to collect for the Saturn. And then I'd ask, like, why? Are you doing it for nostalgia purposes? Are you doing it as a publicity stunt? Why are you collecting for the Saturn? I would say maybe, just dip your toe into the Sega Saturn with like an ODE or flash cart. Try some of the games, find out what you like, and if you do end up falling in love with some Saturn games, then you can maybe collect those games. And I think that might be a good way to go, rather than just saying, okay, I'm going to collect the entire library. That is not for the faint of heart. I have gone for an almost complete US long box collection, and I kind of stopped because there was just some filler, so, and I'm not about filler. I like all killer, no filler, but I'm not gonna, spend $60 to $100 on a game that's like really garbage, like don't get the Crow, right? And even the Crow is not necessarily cheap anymore. Considering it's such a terrible game, I wouldn't recommend anybody buys that and collects that. That's just gonna take up space on your shelf and not be worth it. It might be worth still collecting Japanese games, but maybe not like the shmups, because even the market has gone on those. But there's so many great Japanese games out there that are still affordable, between $20, $30, and $40. There's even some games that can be had for $5 to $10 that have a higher, language barrier. Or maybe, they're like visual novels and stuff like that, but there's just a ton of great stuff on the Japanese side that's still affordable, but it's not always going to be that way. So the Sega Saturn is definitely worth playing. But as far as whether it's worth collecting or not, I think that really depends on you. And how serious are you? If you're in love with the console and you just want to go deeper and you're willing to invest, then I say go for it. But just buyer beware. It's not cheap. It's not Neo Geo crazy, but it is getting there. So yeah. Next panel, we have why Sega Saturn. Why Sega Saturn failed. It's probably, let's see here. Why is Sega Saturn hard to emulate? So first I'm going to say Sega Saturn is not hard to emulate, but this is a classic age-old question, and I think this probably goes back to a time when Sega Saturn was hard to emulate. So at some point you have to go back in time. The Saturn's architecture is not exactly simple. It does have kind of a complex architecture. There are a lot of chips. You have the 2 VDPs, video display processors, 2 SH2 CPUs, you've got DSPs, you've got the sound controller, you've got the CD block, you've got a bunch of stuff going on there. And it may have at some point been harder to emulate, because of that complex architecture. But it's been over a decade, maybe more. I mean, I've been enjoying Saturn emulation for just, like I said, over a decade, so I really think that this is just kind of like one of those myths that gets kicked around and it just never dies out because it just gets regurgitated so much. And folks who may have not dipped their toe into the Saturn scene, may just still believe this because so many people have repeated it. But yeah, so the Sega Saturn is no longer hard to emulate. And in fact, they've even got hardware emulation going with field programmable gate arrays. The Mr. project uses FPGA to actually emulate the actual chips, and that's even better than software emulation. That is a precise one-to-one replication of the entire chipset of the Saturn. So it basically behaves exactly like a real Saturn would, flaws and all, So yeah, no, it's come a long way, but yeah, I would say that this is no longer the case. Why was Sega Saturn a failure? And we kind of talked about this back on the what happened to Sega Saturn question. In terms of its commercial performance in the West, it really came down to poor marketing. It came down to that rushed launch, which led to, developers not being able to get games out in time, and then poor relationships with retailers who were not getting stock of the console and then decided they didn't want to work with Sega because they kind of left them out of the loop. And that all came back to that early rush launch. Really, really bad marketing. Of course, Sega lost Steve Race, who went over to Sony and PlayStation. And so they kind of like went in a different direction with their marketing, more or less marketing to kids rather than marketing to adults like it should have been. Teens that had grown up with the Genesis, who bought into that attitude and that kind of style of the Genesis, would have been grown up and would have been young adults and would have wanted something different, and instead Sega was kind of marketing to a younger demographic. And of course, anybody who is in that younger demographic was probably going to wait and get a Nintendo 64, or wasn't buying their own console anyway, and their parents were going to buy a Nintendo 64. So you just had like really poor marketing, and you had some infighting between Sega of America and Sega Japan. They just couldn't get on the same page about stuff. And of course, Sega of America was beholden to Sega of Japan to really ship anything. Like most games that were being made, it was like Sega of America was just sitting on their hands and waiting for Sega of Japan to send them stuff. A lot of times they would rush stuff out. They'd be like, gimme, gimme, and they just rush games out early just to get them out for the holidays, but then they would perform poorly. Because of the fact that Sony was doing so well with their third parties and they had such good relationship with third parties. Not many third parties were developing games on Saturn, which led to this kind of overall poor perception in the marketplace. That also led to stores not really giving them prominent shelf space. They would really kind of push the consoles like PlayStation and Nintendo 64 in favor of Saturn, which would kind of get relegated to like the back of the store, bottom shelf, that kind of thing. It's all of those things put together would be why I would say the Saturn failed in the US. Also, we, as in, the public, the consumer, didn't really embrace Sega Saturn. But a lot of people would say that they didn't know about Sega Saturn because it just didn't reach them. And that all comes back to the marketing and just, many, many fumbles along the way. But yeah, so I would also argue that Saturn, taken on its own merits as a game console, is not a failure. It's quite an amazing console with so many great games, and just looked at objectively, I think it's a great console and it's a success. It was a success for me because, I got one and I loved it and I still do. And of course it was a success in Japan, where Sega made a lot of good decisions. So anyway, that hopefully answers that question again more thoroughly. We also have here, why is Sega Saturn so expensive? And I think that really would come down to how it performed back then. Means that they didn't make as many. It didn't last as long on the market, so they didn't make nearly as many as they did with the PlayStation, which lasted into the 2000s. And they made so many more of them because they sold so many more. So yeah, with the Saturn, it's just one of those things where a lot of people slept on it back in the day, and now the demand has gone up, but the supply is not there. So again, supply and demand, both important things that go together, but when the demand goes up but the supply is not there, you're going to have higher costs. And that's the case with the games. There weren't as many printed because there weren't as many sold. And there weren't nearly as many units of hardware produced as there were PlayStations or Nintendo 64s. And so, yeah, it really comes down to supply and demand. Next question. We've got how Sega Saturn. Let's see what we have here. How many Sega Saturn games are there? Well, this is a tough one. Not one that I can just answer off the top of my head, but I'm going to cheat a little bit and look at Satakore, which is a good site to go by. It's very thorough, and there's a good chance if they're off by anything, it's probably one or two games. According to Satakore, they've got 1,970 games total, basically counting like retail discs. And then if we look at Japan alone, we've got 1,270 entries. And then if we just look at the US, so in the United States, 257 entries. Some people say it's 258. Satakore says 257. I'm gonna go with 257. And then let's look at Europe, all of Europe, basically PAL games. You got 304 entries. So they actually got more games in Europe than they did in the US. But anyway, yeah, 1,970 Saturn games. So yeah, definitely not as many as the PlayStation had, but nothing to sneeze at. Next up, we have, how do you burn Sega Saturn games? I can't do like a live tutorial here, but there's a good article on SegaSaturnShiro.com that'll kind of walk you through that process if that's something you're interested in doing. Though I will say it's less and less of a real necessity to burn games these days with all of the other ways that you can play Sega Saturn games, either be it emulation or via ODE or flash cart. So, but if you really want to go that route and you kind of want to use your CD-ROM drive, and you can't do retail games because obviously retail games are going to be ideal if you're using the CD-ROM drive. I guess, use the tutorial below and hopefully that'll get you where you need to go. Okay, so next up we have, how do you mod a Sega Saturn? Again, I cannot do a live tutorial on this video, but there are several ways that you can mod a Sega Saturn. You can install a mod chip to allow you to play different region games, allow you to play backups, completely bypass the copy protection. You can install new capacitors. If you have bad caps or you're just worried about that, you can install new capacitors. You can install an FRAM mod that will make it so you don't have to use the battery backup for the memory. It replaces your memory ROM to a non-volatile flash memory, and you'll be able to store saves indefinitely. There's that you can mod. You can mod your power supply and replace your power supply with a low voltage power supply, so you don't have that 120 volts coming in. You've also got mods where you can put in an ODE, swap in an ODE in place of your CD-ROM drive. Or if you want to keep the CD-ROM drive and you also want to have an ODE, there are things like the Fenrir switcher, where you can have a Fenrir ODE and you can have the CD-ROM drive and just kind of switch between them. Then of course there are a lot of soft mods, which are either the cart or the satiator. They technically bypass the CD block and allow you to do all sorts of cool stuff, but you're not really permanently modifying the console. There's a bunch of different cool looking replacement shells that you can personalize your Saturn with and kind of make it your own. So there's that as well. Some folks even like to do this thing where they swap their controller buttons. Take a control pad, Japanese white controller, and then a black controller or a gray controller, and then swap the buttons. And you can do the same thing with the shell and get all these different kind of effects. So that's fun. If you have several Saturns and you want to kind of mix and match, that's another way you can mod it. There are articles out there that you can find that will walk you through those processes. But anyway, so those are some ways that you can mod your Saturn. Lastly on this panel, we have how many Sega Saturn were sold. Bad grammar, by the way, but I mentioned this before. Sega has given a conservative estimate of 8.8 million. There are other conservative estimates out there that are 9.25 million. And then there are some not so conservative estimates that are around 11.5 million, all the way up to 14 million. And I'm not sure if those are just counting, variations of the console, or if they're counting the Tech Toy Saturn sold in Brazil. I'm not exactly sure what those numbers are all counting. And Sega's conservative amount could just be limited to their own stock. It might not include, the V Saturns, so maybe when you add all of the Saturns from Victor, JVC, Hitachi, Samsung, and Tectoy, you get one of those higher figures, but either way, if we stay conservative, we can say that there were at least 8.8 million Saturns sold worldwide. And that brings us down to our very last panel. There's only two questions on here. Could Sonic Mania run on Sega Saturn? I think so. Maybe not as it's currently programmed. It would probably have to be targeted to the Sega Saturn, and so I don't see Sonic Mania doing anything per se that Saturn couldn't do, albeit at a lower resolution, you know, because the Saturn's obviously going to be outputting lower resolution. We've seen port of Sonic Mania to the Dreamcast, and I know there's efforts to port it to other consoles. Who knows? Maybe somebody will figure out a way to get it on Saturn at some point. But just when it comes to like, could the Saturn run Sonic Mania? I don't see why not. Saturn is great at pushing 2D sprites, and lots of them really fast. And yeah, I definitely think that if somebody took the time and they put the love and the craft into creating it for Sega Saturn, that it absolutely could run Sonic Mania. Last but not least, could Sega make another console? I mean, they could make another console, but would they? Or, you know, would it be successful? No, I don't think so. Like, I don't think that at this point, Sega has any interest in getting back into the hardware business outside of the, you know, the little mini consoles, you know, where they're kind of just cashing in on their retro library, because it just wouldn't make sense. You know, think about it this way. It was hard enough for them to exist in the market with 3 other competitors, Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony, right? And it was hard enough for them to exist in that market. And you look at folks who came after them like Ouya, really hard for them, even though they had some things going for them, really hard for them to sustain in a market like that. So, you know, not only was it hard to begin with for Sega to exist with that kind of competition, but it would be even more hard for them to come back and try to re-enter the market as a hardware manufacturer. I just don't see that happening outside of like the mini consoles, which I said, we're really just cashing in on nostalgia. And, you know, you could pretty much guarantee those will move because of the low price and the fact that they have a bunch of games already on them, you know, that people know and love. But as for a new console, no, I don't think so. Now, of course, Sega still make arcade games, and they're really good at that. So, you know, definitely Sega is going to continue to do software, but I definitely don't think that they could do hardware again without it just failing miserably. And they would never do that, right? You know, because we have enough hindsight now, and we have enough information to know that that just would not succeed. But yeah, so that's where I stand on that. I think it's really wishful thinking for folks to kind of wish and hope that there'd be like a Dreamcast 2 or, you know, there'd be another Sega console, but I just don't think that that's even possible at this point from a financial standpoint. But that pretty much wraps it up for the internet's questions on Sega Saturn, at least what I was able to pull up from Google. And if you have any questions that I didn't answer, please feel free to email me or shoot me a message in our Discord server. I've linked those down below in the description. And yeah, be sure to join the Sega Saturn SHIRO Discord server. There are a lot of knowledgeable folks who are more than happy to answer any questions you may have about Sega Saturn. And it's just amazing that the Sega Saturn has been around for 30 years. It's kind of hard to believe that this thing came out 30 years ago. And that definitely does make me feel old. But, you know, I have enjoyed 30 years with this console. And it's just amazing the amount of cool things that are happening on the console nowadays with homebrew and fan translations, new controllers, new peripherals, a bunch of great stuff for the console. But yeah, there's never been a better time to get a Sega Saturn, to get into its library. If you happen to sleep on it back in the day, if you were a PlayStation fan or a Nintendo 64 fan, certainly no problem with those consoles, but I highly recommend that you give Sega Saturn a chance and you check it out. It's just got a wealth of great games and great gaming experiences that you can check out in 2025, because we're rolling around to 2025 already. But yeah, this has been SaturnDave, reminding you that you must play Sega Saturn. Until next time, I'll catch you later. See ya.
SEGA SATURN SHIRO